Hey climbers, this is Climb by VSC, a weekly show about building and scaling startups in the world of climate innovation. My name is Vijay Kapoor, general partner of VSC Ventures and co-host of Climb. Every week, I or a member of our VSC team will speak with a pioneer in the climate tech world about emerging technologies and novel ideas that will turn the tide on climate change. We've heard enough of the doom and gloom. Now we're sharing stories of innovation that lead to sustainable, positive change. In today's episode, you'll hear my conversation with Catherine Boudreau, fresh off of her trip from the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt, also known as COP27. As a journalist, Catherine has been deep in covering sustainability initiatives at the company level, decision-making at the government level, and more recently, tracking the flow of investor capital into climate tech. I learned a ton from her in this conversation, and I know you will too. I'm so happy that you've decided to join us. Now, let's climb. Hey climbers, welcome back to Climb by VSC. I am so excited to be joined today by Catherine Boudreau, who is a senior sustainability reporter at Insider. Catherine, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so you have been covering sustainability, the environment, the intersection of government, food and ag, and technology for many years. So maybe let's start with a little bit of the origin story. What drew you to this topic, and why did this become your calling?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always knew I wanted to be a reporter from a young age, but it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to write about. When I graduated from college, I got hired at this company, Bloomberg BNA, a subsidiary of Bloomberg, and I wasn't a reporter at the time. So I was looking for opportunities to jump into doing more writing, and the first job that came up was a food and agriculture reporter. So first things first, I was like, yay, I get to be a reporter. And then I actually learned over time that I really did actually have a passion for writing about food and nutrition. I'm originally from Vermont, and I've just always had an interest in where my food comes from, who grows it, the health impacts, but also the environmental impacts of how we produce food. So pretty quickly, I really enjoyed that beat. But then fast forward to doing that for like 6 or 7 years, covering what was happening at the government level. Really, the government wasn't doing a lot at the intersection of like food and the environment. And I just really wanted to move into more environmental and sustainability reporting. And I think that was partly because I saw, like under the Trump administration, the government really wasn't doing much on this. So, reporting about policy wasn't really doing it for me because not a lot of action was happening. Of course, that's changed dramatically under the Biden administration. But, in March 2020, I believe just right at the onset of the pandemic is when I switched into more sustainability reporting at my former position at POLITICO. And I liked that I got to cover business because a lot of the action was happening at the business sector. And I thought that they were a little bit more dynamic than what the government was up to at the time. So that's why I decided to make the switch.
One of the things that we always like to talk about on the show is what's changed, right? VCs always love to ask the question, why now? Why this is different? So maybe from your coverage and your research, how has the discourse really changed in the time that you've been covering, sustainability broadly, or even some of the more specific topics that you've been covering?
Yeah, I think, I wanted to cover the climate crisis because I did feel like that was the most important issue of my time. And that's the biggest reason I moved into sustainability reporting, because I thought that was a good avenue. So I can kind of speak to how that's changed.
Sure.
And especially like when I was reporting on food and agriculture, I would say that the climate conversation was like, I don't want to say non-existent, but it wasn't really a big conversation in like the 2018 Farm Bill, for example. Like there was some talk of like conservation programs, but it wasn't a big theme. And also when I went out and talked to farmers, I think that you just had to be, at least at the time, I had to be kind of careful about how I talked about climate stuff, because I think there was a lot of politics. There is a lot of politics wrapped up in talking about climate change. And I think if you just talk about it as like a way to improve the land and the soil, and farmers are great about talking about that. I think that's shifting for sure. Again, I'm not on the like food and ag beat still, but I know other colleagues that have done reporting, and that conversation is definitely happening. I think at the farm level, there's also just a lot of food companies that are really, really invested in regenerative agriculture. Like they want to hit their climate targets in their scope 3 supply chain emissions. And a big portion of that is agriculture. So I think the conversation is really on climate is being driven sometimes by the food industry. And then, you have all these like startups that are trying to help farmers and food companies measure their emissions. So I think that's changed a lot. And then just in general, I think reporters are much better at covering climate as it intersects with so many different beats. So, my first avenue was food and agriculture, but now I'm reporting on climate in the intersection of like any industry, whether it's, of course, energy, agriculture, sometimes healthcare, sometimes finance, sometimes tech. So I think that just overall the journalism is getting better. And of course now sustainability is on the agenda and climate is on the agenda of every corporation. So there's just a lot to write about now, more so than in the past, I think.
It's so interesting you said that. One of our first guests on the show was Rob Leclerc from AgFunder. Mm-hmm. And, he was telling me about the origin story of AgFunder and the idea being that back when they started it as, a newsletter and a publication, nobody was really talking about technology development in agriculture. Yeah. And to hear you say hey, that's actually somebody's beat now. It was your beat for a while. Somebody's really spending time and understanding how all these different implications are trickling down to our food, supply chain and our food ecosystem. It's I think heartening to see, because even as Americans, I don't think we really think about where our food comes from. And then, to extrapolate it further, the things that you're talking about, how these different industries are contributing to the broader crisis, right? I think we're all, as consumers, always thinking about plastic straws and how we're cognizant of our own consumption. And I don't think we necessarily always see the bigger picture in terms of what's happening, at an industry level. So it's interesting to hear you say that, it's just being talked about more, and more publications are putting staff towards it.
Absolutely. Yeah. The number of reporters covering climate now, and the places that are staffing up to cover this issue is incredible to see. I think it just reflects how we've shifted our perspective on how to cover something like the climate crisis.
So let's talk about your beat today, and I guess how do you define it, and then what are some of the storylines that you are following in 2023, or sort of have a keen eye towards in the coming year?
Yeah, so my beat is always shifting because it is a little bit of an experiment. I think the sustainability beat is very new. So when I took a position at POLITICO in 2020 as a sustainability reporter, I didn't know that many of them who had a similar title. And again, a lot of my beat is focused on climate. So of course there's there's a lot of climate reporters, but sustainability in general is extremely broad. So I would say that I've been, experimenting a lot over the last 7 months or so at Insider with what resonates with readers. And I can just say that, climate solutions broadly is popular, I think, because people are looking for some optimism. I feel like it's important to cover the doom and gloom situation, which is yes, we're not moving fast enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And but at the same time, there's a lot of companies and entrepreneurs and even, governments that are working on solutions. So I think that's a big part of my focus. And I kind of bucket those into the biggest emitters because, finding solutions in sectors like fossil fuels, agriculture, cement, steel, residential and commercial buildings, those are going to make that solutions in those sectors are going to make a big dent in the emissions equation. So yeah, that's a big focus. But that said, I do want to also cover some of the just the pure science sometimes, which is okay, where are we headed in terms of global warming? How hot is the ocean getting? Just those papers that come out that keep us in a reality check, essentially. Mm-hmm. But then beyond that, I think readers are also looking for advice about how they can take steps in their own life to live more sustainably. So whether that's the food that you buy, or how do you reduce your plastic consumption, or how do you avoid microplastic because it's everywhere, as we're learning. How do you shop for clothes that in a more sustainable way? How do you change where you live? anything that I can do to connect like the climate crisis or sustainability in general to just like your everyday, I think it is really compelling. So I would say those are some of the main themes of my reporting. And then of course, like I cover here and there the geopolitics of climate. So, whenever world leaders are making big announcements, doing big meetings and things like that on the climate crisis, I definitely cover that too.
Yeah, I want to come back to that last bit, especially in COP27 in a second. I really like the point that you mentioned about making the climate crisis real for the reader. And I think it's almost like it's just human nature, right? When a problem seems so insurmountable, when it seems so big, even when as a human we have a to-do list and you're like, okay, that's a really big one. Let me do the easy thing over here because it's easy to do. I tend to find that a lot when I speak with people where there is just there's just a level of like dejection or kind of like, hey, it's out of my hands. I can't really do anything about it. I'm going to live my life. And I appreciate that you and I think a lot of the new writers that are kind of coming onto the sustainability beat are so focused on, bringing that combination of, okay, there's optimism. Here's what the science is saying. And here's the last bit, like why it's real for you. What makes a story compelling for you before we talk about COP27 and some of the geopolitical aspects of it? When you are researching, when you're looking into, a new technology or a new trend, what sort of gets your radar going where you're like, okay, this is something I want to lean in and learn more about? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in terms of evaluating some of the like exciting innovations that are happening, I think I tend to ask like, is it commercially like scalable? And I'm not the expert usually ever on that. I have to interview a lot of people to decipher that. So, just is it going to be able to be scaled and be like profitable or at least eventually profitable? And, that's something I look for a lot. And again, I rely on a lot of other sources to tell me whether that's true or not. And also too, like if it's a solution, it's something innovative, like are there regulatory tailwinds backing it? I think that always like helps a new technology advance from like the lab to, pre-trial to commercial stage. So I think I'm just trying to decipher like how realistic is it? And also like, could it be a solution that applies broadly to an industry or can be adopted broadly in an industry within like a reasonable time frame? Because like it's just true that we're kind of in a crisis mode and we only have so much time before we break through some of these thresholds that scientists have said is like catastrophic global warming. So that's kind of the things I ask when it comes to the climate solutions. And I mean, I think also I'm looking for somebody who can help tell the story in a compelling way. So, if they adopted a solution in their own life and they really got a return on investment or it just like it worked well. I did a story about how a guy in Colorado, for example, like totally electrified his home. And when there was that really awful snowstorm earlier this year, he was, monitoring everything in his home about how well his like heat pump performed, because there is a lot of, I think, misconceptions about heat pumps, for example. And that story ended up doing really well because it's like, here's a guy who electrified his home and it helped dispel some of the myths, I think, about some of the electric technology that's being talked about in terms of electrifying homes. And so, yeah, that did pretty well with readers because I think it's just like an example of somebody who can tell the story and tell it in a compelling way. I can help do that. And then I'll just say, like, flat out, I don't cover, like, company announcements of a new sustainability goal anymore. Like, that, I used to cover that, like, I guess, 3 years ago now. But no longer. Now, if a company has some sort of goal they want to announce, like, typically I wouldn't cover it. If they made progress, that's interesting to me, and I want to know how they did it. And I really love when companies are transparent about why they failed to meet a goal. And how they're trying to like solve that. I think that's really interesting too.
I mean, as a reader, that would be fascinating for me, right? We saw in like 2020, 2021, all these companies start coming out with ESG policies and ESG goals and being very public about them. And, not to feel cynical about it, but like I'm kind of looking at the current economic environment that we are in. And I'm kind of like, how many of these folks are going to actually stick to those goals? Or if they don't stick to them, if they do have to amend them, how many of them are going to sort of like be as public about lowering the goalpost when they actually have to do it. And I don't know if you've seen examples of it, but I would be very surprised if these very aggressive goals that folks have kept to about, net zero by 2030, if they make a lot of progress in them in the next couple of years when they're just trying to stay afloat and, try not to have layoffs.
No, absolutely. I think the economy is a factor. I also think that I've heard a lot from some of the entrepreneurs I've talked to and like C-suite executives and consultants, all the consultants that these corporations hire to help them solve these big problems in climate. Like there's analysis paralysis. It's like, how do you actually do it? Because you're totally disrupting business models in some cases, an entire industry. So I think there is a little bit of like, oh, we have to measure everything instead of baseline, which, okay, maybe true, but like it's not really like rocket science in some cases that, okay, you have to probably, shift away from fossil fuels, which a lot of companies are doing. They're definitely investing more in renewables, obviously. But then, some of the harder challenges is like new materials that aren't so carbon intensive, or, we just don't have solutions yet for some things like steel. How do you decarbonize steel? That's a big challenge. So,
yeah, or they go out and buy carbon credits, right? Which has always been one of my pet peeves. The number of carbon credit marketplace startups that we have been pitched since we launched our fund a couple of years ago. Seems like there's a new one every month. I'm sure you've come across them as well. Is there anything innovative in that category that as you're meeting these companies or you're learning about sort of different modalities of carbon markets, like anything stand out to you that's any unique? Because I've been woefully surprised at the lack of like innovation in that space.
Yeah, I hear you. I feel like, covering carbon credits is a challenging one for me personally, because I do feel like there's a new headline every day, like these credits are horrible and you can't verify them. And then of course, there's the crediting bodies that are saying, look, like, yes, this is challenging, but we've protected a lot of forests through these credits, and you can't account for every like future variable, which is true. So I just find it really challenging to cover carbon credits. And I think it's interesting that there's all this work being done to improve like the integrity of them. Because really there isn't one like universal, like any regulatory body or anything like that that's really policing it. So you're kind of relying on these crediting bodies to verify it. And and the companies aren't transparent about when they're using credits, if they're using them to get to their net zero goal, where the projects are. Like there's just a real lack of transparency across the board. So I find it extremely challenging to cover that.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because nature-based solutions from a cost standpoint are still so much more viable than some of the mechanical capture stuff. I think you and I spoke about when we connected before this call. Like, I've been fascinated by carbon capture and storage, and yet when you just look at on a per like metric ton basis, it's still better to just go out and plant trees. And so I've been actually surprised by the lack of transparency, the lack of a centralized body that can basically say and have the authority. And maybe that's going to be on a country by country level. I can't imagine that we would have like a national governing sort of thing, but that's kind of where the geopolitics of covering carbon credits comes into play. So maybe we'll transition there. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I'd love to chat about COP27. If not.
Oh yeah, of course. One thing I was just going to add about nature-based solutions is that I think that the pledges to like plant trees and do nature-based solutions, like I think there's too many corporate pledges than the land we have available. Like I'm pretty sure that's actually true. And so I think that just drives home the point that, okay, yes, it's important to plant trees, protect nature, improve biodiversity. And I think carbon credits could probably help achieve some of those goals, but reducing greenhouse gas emissions from industry is really important. Like that has to be the focus, decarbonization, like you can't plant your way out of the climate crisis essentially.
Yeah, I like that. That's very fair. And I think when we start to look at the scale of some of the, shipping, international flights, like even fashion, right? Like the amount of contribution year on year, there's just not enough trees for us to plant. So I echo exactly what you're saying there. So we've been jumping around it a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it because I know you spent quite a bit of time covering COP27. You were there on the ground. What was that experience like? And, are there 2 or 3 things that you've sort of taken away from it that have stayed with you over your time covering COP27?
Yeah, so this was my first time covering a UN climate summit, and it was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So I think I went in knowing that I had a huge learning curve, but it was such a rewarding experience because, one, I got to meet people from all over the world who I would not get to meet. So I got to interview like indigenous leaders from Brazil about what it meant that there was a new president, President Lula, and how that might impact deforestation, illegal mining, and logging that had spiked under President Bolsonaro. So that was really interesting. And I got to talk to a lot of climate activists who were pretty alarmed that Africa and many countries in Africa have become potential sources of natural gas for Europe because of the war in Ukraine. So, of course, a lot of climate activists were there protesting some of the deals that have happened between European nations and African nations. But that also sparks another like controversial topic that arose at COP, which is, a lot of leaders from Africa were saying, Western nations have industrialized using fossil fuels. They have rich economies. Like, why are we not able to do that as well? We want to bring people out of energy poverty. You did that with fossil fuels. So, like, how are you going to tell us not to do the same? I think there's just that, like, undercurrent of inequality and climate justice that was really, really prominent with the conference being in Africa and in Egypt. So I would say like that was a really, really important current that ran through COP. And I think that will play out a little bit this next year, but this COP is in Dubai, COP28, hosted by the UAE. And I think the focus there is more going to be like, will countries agree to phase down fossil fuels when the host country is actually planning to invest in more fossil fuels? They're investing in renewable energy too, but the Emirates have continued to expand their oil exports. So I think that's like the overarching question of this upcoming COP.
Yeah, I appreciate the summary there. One of the things that was really talked about before the event, and I'm curious how much of a focus there was during COP this year, was this idea of like, what do we owe to each other, right? Kind of thing. Like industrialized nations, the pollution that has been put into the world as a result of America and sort of other industrialized nations is now affecting, floods in Pakistan and Bangladesh and sea levels rising in Southeast Asia. Was this something that was was this made a bigger deal before the event, or was it actually talked about where, not to say like climate reparations, but like that there is actual investment that needs to be made by these industrial countries in helping the countries that are actually suffering the worst effects?
Absolutely. That was probably the biggest development at COP27, which is countries agreed to establish what's called a loss and damage fund. And, this is separate from other climate finance mechanisms. It would be a separate pot of money specifically for what you just talked about, which is like wealthier nations that are historically responsible for the most emissions would contribute, X amount of funds into this loss and damage fund to help pay for the climate devastation that's already happened in places like Pakistan with the flooding and in island nations. I'm thinking of like Trinidad and Tobago, for example, that are dealing with rising sea levels, through no fault of their own. So that was definitely a major takeaway. I think, there's what in UN climate politics, like things take a long time. So I would be skeptical that nations would really make a lot of progress at COP28. I could be mistaken, but if they actually agreed on who pays what, that would be shocking to me.
Yeah. From your time there, is there anything that you've seen, or even just in your time covering sustainability and climate change, are there lessons that the U.S. can take from what other countries are doing, whether it's on capping industrial emissions or just how they're thinking about like their cities and urbanization as it relates to climate? I'm curious who you think is actually leading the way on this and what we can learn from them.
Well, I mean, I think that it is clear that the Biden administration is thinking about the energy transition as like an industrial policy, which I think is really important. Obviously, that's happened in China already. They're the leader in so many renewable energy technologies, and we import solar panels, et cetera. They're a leader in EVs. So I do feel like the fact that the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act and they're subsidizing not only renewable energy, but like batteries, making batteries and semiconductors and sourcing critical minerals that are actually put into those batteries for our EVs and many other devices. That's key. That's very strategic because right now we import, again, a lot of our critical minerals from China. So diversifying the sources of that is really key. So I think that making the energy transition and industrial policy is a good way to go. I also just think it's really challenging to build things in the U.S. I just wrote this story with a colleague of mine, and we were talking to some analysts of like big transit projects. Of course, doing public transportation is better than everybody driving around in their cars, but it's just so hard to and costly. It takes a long time to build in the U.S., whether it's because of just the layers of government involved in getting a project approved. There's lots of different opportunities for anyone to block the process or disrupt the process, sue over a project. And I think one source I talked to put it this way, like we're too good at democracy basically when it comes to some of these projects because everybody can have input and it can slow things down. So I think anything that can speed up like getting renewable energy projects built or maybe some manufacturing plants that of course comes with trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs, but that's just the fact of it is like we have to expand renewable energy to meet our climate goals. So.
No, you're so spot on. What blew my mind as I was learning about how European nations handle it versus again like one of the best things about the U.S. is that we are 50 states. One of the worst things about the U.S. is that we are 50 states, right? Is that like the lessons from a construction project in one state does not go over to the bordering state because different policies and different local governments and just zoning and like zoning issues that we have. I was looking at Japan, for example. Japan has like 26 zones. The U.S. has like 22,000. Yeah. And so it's mind-boggling that, the amount of time that you are spending in a construction project, and again, that's time, that's resources, that's dollars spent, and that also means that the end cost of a project, whether it's as a taxpayer or as a private investor, ends up being so much higher. I'm spot on with you there. I don't know if this is something that any administration can tackle, like federalizing zoning and codes, but like that might be the most boring answer sometimes is the most useful one, Agreed.
I know. I don't have the answers. I mean, I know that there was a lot of talk about Senator Joe Manchin's permitting reform bill. I'm not an expert in that, something that is part of my homework because writing about the challenge of building in the U.S. is fascinating to me and will be so crucial as all this money gets out the door from the Inflation Reduction Act. So just something that's a trend for sure that I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, one of the things coupling the amount of government dollars coming in is also the amount of private dollars that are coming in. And I had spoken briefly ahead of time that like looking at the data, there's more billions of dollars spent in 2022 than the entire clean tech 1.0 boom from call it 06 to 2011, whenever you want to start and stop the clock. Yeah. What has surprised you in terms of maybe where the dollars are going or who's actually allocating the capital as you are covering the sort of broad shift of private dollars coming into climate and sustainability?
Yeah, well, I think, the three areas, there were some trends I wrote about recently about where the money is headed after I talked to just some venture capitalists. And, regenerative agriculture was an obvious one to me, and I think that's just because I do have a background in food and ag reporting, so I know that there's a lot of investment going into like how to help farmers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, improve biodiversity, like create metrics around that. So that one was pretty obvious to me, but the other one that like it seems kind of boring, but it's just kind of really applicable to our daily life, which is, how can my power provider communicate to me when the best time to use energy is so that my bill will go down, I'll be using more renewables? Like, I think that's really fascinating and also just kind of mundane. It's like, but it's just something really practical that homeowners could do, like in their own house. It's like get a smart panel and hook it up to your mobile phone and get alerts about now is the best time to use electricity, or not, demand is really high, it's expensive, and here's a good time to use renewables. I think that's super interesting, and it just hasn't been, probably widely deployed. Whether it's a company disrupting the utility sector or utilities themselves, I think they're all trying to figure this one out, especially as more electric vehicles come onto the grid, because obviously those are going to be using a lot of power, so you want to kind of optimize when they're charging and everything. So I thought that is an interesting trend that wasn't just didn't automatically resonate off the bat. And then another one that I talked to investors about was like commercial shipping. And that's like ripe for disruption because I guess the shipping companies aren't doing a lot of research and development. They're not pouring a lot of money into that. So that means there's a lot of room for innovation.
Yeah. The piece about accessibility for like, I guess, what's the right word for it? Access to our own power consumption and actually understanding that. It's so fascinating you mentioned that. And, the show, we have a lot of entrepreneurs that listen. The sort of broader lesson I take from it is sometimes like simplifying and making transparent something that is already happening in the background can in and of itself be a valuable business opportunity because, I think about like, even, Uber and what they did to taxis, like knowing exactly what a ride's going to cost. Like that little shift actually creates a lot of value for us as consumers. So to your point of like, yeah, what is the cost savings of a heat pump? What is the, accessibility of getting more folks to put solar projects? Like the lack of penetration in just residential solar uses, right, is mind-boggling to me because the cost of a panel has come down exponentially over 10 years, but the number of people putting solar panels up on their rooftops has not increased at the same rate. And so to your point, like there's probably real value for an entrepreneur or even a big business to go ahead and just make that process transparent for us. I don't think it's going to be the power companies. I think they make money in the opaque, in the opaque, basically. But somebody coming along and sort of stepping in the middle and saying, "Hey, let me actually show you where your power is going," could be a viable business.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk a little bit as we sort of close out. What is something that gives you optimism about this current fight against climate change?
So I'll say two things. The first being that, in the topic of venture capital, for example, or, entrepreneurs, a lot of people are leaving, I think, their jobs to go into the climate space. I just wrote a story about how, the big tech layoffs could actually have a silver lining for climate startups, for example, because the talent pool is a lot better. And I think in talking to some employees who have already made the leap from a big tech company to a climate startup, they really dispelled maybe some myths about how you maybe have to take a pay cut, or how you have to really have a specific skill set. Like these climate startups are looking for people who work in HR, who work in finance, who are scientists and engineers and everything, like software engineers or like a chemical engineer. So the jobs are across the board, and I think especially like younger generations want to have careers with purpose and meaning. I think the pandemic really crystallized that for a lot of people. Like, how can if I'm going to spend, 40 to 60 hours a week doing something, like maybe there could be like a higher purpose associated with it. So I think that gives me hope. And then I think also just this report from the International Energy Agency, which said that $1.4 trillion poured into clean energy projects in 2022. So that's like solar farms and batteries, electric vehicle charging stations. That is more than ever before, and it's more than what poured into new oil and gas projects. So, I mean, even though we are like still not moving fast enough to phase away from fossil fuels, like I thought that was very encouraging.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. I think to add on to the $1.4 trillion going in, and even the $28 billion in venture capital going in, I think this year especially, it feels like we've shifted from the idea of climate investing being impact investing. Mm-hmm. And impact investing always carries this like sort of, oh, we're going to lose money on it, but everybody feels good, to actually being like, oh, this is a wealth generation opportunity for some entrepreneur. This is the equity value of these startups is actually going to mean something to these, thousands of employees that are coming on and working in climate. And so to me, I think it's like that mindset shift is going to drive the best talent to come work on climate. It's going to drive more investors. And ideally, it's going to drive, really smart founders that could be doing anything with their time to come and work on this problem. So, that capital, I think, turns into a lot of different things over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Catherine, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think my two biggest takeaways on the work that you're doing is, one, there are so many folks that are now kind of having an eye towards climate and sustainability. You've been driving this beat for a long time, but I'm glad to see that there are even more writers writing about this. And especially on the geopolitical side and sort of the global side, I'm going to keep up with your reporting and reading about this, about how the U.S. is trying to attain some energy independence, but then also understanding that as industrialized nations, there is sensitivity with which we have to sort of look at our role in the world and sort of what we're able to tell nations that are in the industrialization process now in terms of how they're able to, cap emissions in industrials. That's something I think interesting for all of us to think about, especially those of us that are listening here in the U.S. So I thank you for your time and your perspectives today, Catherine, and really excited that we got to have you on Climb by VSC.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Would love to have you back sometime soon.
Anytime.
All right.
Take care.
Well, that's all for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. A few quick shout outs before you go. Our thanks to Catherine for sharing her experience and learnings from COP27 with us. You can follow her at CE Boudreau on Twitter to keep up with her reporting. Special thanks to Credo for their help in producing and promoting this episode. To visit any part of today's conversation again, you can find the full transcript on vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Ramiro for posting these every week. Lastly, if you've listened this far, please leave us a rating on Spotify or a review on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I know, still climate neutral. That's it for now. We'll see you all next week on Climb by VSC.